Welcome to our lecture on memory and learning. First of all, what is memory? Memory is the ability to encode, store, and retrieve information in the brain. According to the Atkinson-Shiffrin's model of memory, there are three processing stages of memory. The first stage is called sensory memory. Sensory memory is the information through your sensory input. This is all the stimulus you're constantly receiving from your environment through your five senses, namely what we see, what we hear, what we smell, touch, and what we taste. Sensory information normally only lasts for less than a second. If you want to remember what you have just experienced with your senses, you need to pay attention to it, so that the information can move to the second stage of processing memory, so-called short-term memory. Let's say you meet a new person who just introduced himself. The moment you hear his name becomes your sensory information. If you do not pay attention to his name at all, you could forget his name even after a second. But if you pay attention to his name because his name sounds funny or he seems like a nice person and you want to remember his name, this information can be stored as a short-term memory. Short-term memory can normally last between 20 to 30 seconds, sometimes even a minute. If you do not further proceed this information by encoding it, for instance, give some meaning or relevance to the name, like thinking that his name is the same as one of your good friends, or even your old high school teacher you used to like, then this information can move to the third stage of processing memory, that is, long-term memory. Long-term memory can be lost after 30 seconds if the information is not constantly rehearsed. For the information to be stored in long-term memory, you need to put efforts into remembering it. For example, saving that person's name and phone number on your phone, or adding him on social media, and so on. Some long-term memory can, however, last for days, months, years, or even permanently. There are two types of long-term memory. One is explicit memory and the other is implicit memory. Explicit memory is conscious memory about events or facts. For example, how your first day in University of Freiburg was like, or the fact that you are a student in University of Freiburg. When explicit memory is about events or experiences you had, this information is called episodic memory. When explicit memory is about the facts or data, it is called semantic memory. In contrast to explicit memory, implicit memory is subconscious, which is remembering something without much effort, such as knowing how to ride a bike, or even to walk or to eat. It is sometimes called motor memory because it often involves your bodily movement. Different parts of the brain are involved for different kinds of memory. For instance, explicit memory involves frontal lobe, temporal lobe, and hippocampus. Implicit memory involves motor cortex and cerebellum. Short-term memory involves prefrontal cortex. You don't need to remember all the names of parts of the brain for this course, but I just want you to know that different parts of the brain is responsible for different kinds of memory. Other than sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, there is also another type of memory called working memory. Some researchers think that there are little differences between short-term memory and working memory because both types of memory have limited capacity. Other researchers think that there are some clear theoretical or neurological differences between these two concepts. What is, however, important for us to know about working memory is that in the working memory, information processing is active and self-initiative. Working memory also involves executive or higher level cognitive functions of the brain. Working memory is also dependent on the long-term memory structure, where you can encode or retrieve from the long-term memory. It is also closely related to academic learning. The most famous working memory model is by Baddeley and Hitch, and it has been revised a few times. They explain that working memory structure can be divided into three components that are central executive, phonological loop, and visual spatial sketchpad. Central executive is responsible for organizing and controlling for all the information you receive through your senses. Phonological loop is responsible for encoding phonological information, that is the sound of language. Visual spatial sketchpad is responsible for encoding visual and spatial information, such as the shape, color, and location of the stimulus. For example, as you listen to my lecture at this moment, the information you receive from listening to my speech is encoded by your phonological loop. The information you receive from looking at my slides visually is encoded by your visual spatial sketchpad. Your central executive communicates with your phonological loop and visual spatial sketchpad to organize all information together. Baddeley later on added a fourth component to the model, called episodic buffer. Episodic buffer is responsible for encoding information in a way that gives meaningful interpretations to the stimulus you receive from your environment. Episodic buffer is also connected to long-term memory. For instance, if you try to connect the information about working memory you're receiving from me right now to what you have learned before in other classes, by establishing a link between your new information about working memory and your previous information about it, it would be done by your episodic buffer. So, how is working memory related to our learning? Working memory and learning, in other words, knowledge acquisition, are interrelated because working memory is basically the ability to store and retrieve learned knowledge, and our learning is the acquisition of knowledge gained through experiences. Working memory and learning outcomes are related to each other. Depending on different kinds of learning outcomes, working memory may be related a little differently. As you can see, based on the correlations between working memory and different kinds of achievement, the relationship can vary between 0.5 and 0.6, which indicates a medium to large size of relationships. Working memory is often more strongly related to academic achievement than short-term memory. Next question I would like to address is, how do we not forget what we learn? Let's assume that you need to memorize this Bradley's working memory model because you think you'll be tested on your final exam. How would you try to memorize this model in a way that you will still remember at the end of the semester? You can pause this video for a minute and think of an effective way to remember this model before I show you 3 different kinds of strategies you can use to memorize this concept. What I would like to show you right now is a memory strategy called mnemonics. Mnemonics are memory strategies that enhance the meaningfulness of the material to be remembered by establishing a meaningful relationship between the concepts to be learned. The first mnemonics I would like to introduce to you is called story-making strategy. You make some kind of an interesting and episodic story to remember the concepts to be learned. For instance, you imagine the story of your first date with your girlfriend. Your phonological loop says she has interesting stories to tell. Because phonological loop is responsible for the information you hear from the sound of her speech. Your episodic buffer says, she reminds me of my first love. Episodic buffer connects your new information with your old information to give meaning to the new information to be stored in your long-term memory. Your visual spatial sketchpad said she's pretty because visual spatial sketchpad is responsible for visual information. Your central executive organizes all the information you receive from your senses all together. By making a story using the concepts to be learned, you're giving meaningful interpretations to each concept using your own example, which helps you remember these concepts much easier and much longer. Another mnemonics is called multi-sensory strategy. Because different sensory information is encoded by different parts of the brain, the more parts of the brain you try to activate when you're remembering the same concept, the more likely that at least one part of the brain will remember this concept in the future. For instance, when you use the story of your first date to remember the working memory model, you can also make this story by using multisensory strategy. For example, you can imagine being in a restaurant with a beautiful ocean view by activating your visual senses. Having a wonderful meal and wine which smells and tastes fantastic. Or hearing a music play by a live band in the background by activating auditory senses. Using these imaginations, you can make the story as an emotional experience as well, so that the part of the brain that is responsible for your feelings and emotions, called amygdala, is also activated when you remember these concepts. Even though it is just imagining your experiences of your senses, research shows that just by imagining your sensory experiences can mimic your brain activity of the actual sensory experiences. The last mnemonics I want to introduce you is called Lotzi strategy. Lotzi means places in Latin. This strategy uses a familiar place you know to remember the learned concepts. You normally imagine a building you know very well, such as a place you live or you work. I will take an example of my apartment to explain how I would remember the working memory model by Bradley. What I did is to first write down the structure of the rooms of my apartment, and then to assign each concept in a working memory model to each of the room in my apartment by giving reasons why each concept should belong to each room. For example, I assign the central executive to the entrance room of my apartment, because central executive is where the information that should be retained or removed is controlled for. The entrance controls for who comes in and who goes out. I also assign phonological loop to my living room because this is where I work and my work involves reading, writing, listening, everything that has to do with the language. I assign visual spatial sketchpad to my kitchen as that is where all the visual magic happens in my apartment with beautiful food I cook. Bathroom is for short-term memory because you don't spend a lot of time in there. Balcony is for sensory information as it is a place where I see information from outside, but not all the information can come inside. Bedroom is for long-term memory as memory consolidation occurs during your sleep. Finally, I assign episodic buffer to my connecting room because episodic buffer connects my new information with my old memory. To sum up, here are the take-home messages of today's lecture. First, memory is an ability to store and retrieve learned knowledge. There are sensory, short-term, long-term, and working memory. Long-term memory can be either explicit, which is about events or facts, or implicit memory. Working memory contains phonological loop, visual spatial sketchpad, episodic buffer, and central executive. Mnemonics are memory strategies which help us learn better. You can make personal stories, use multi-senses, and apply places you know to give meaning to learned concepts, to improve your learning and memory. Thank you for watching my video and see you next week.